1, 2, and welcome back, everyone, to Remember What's Next. Rabbi Ken Spiro from Israel. Welcome back.
It's good to be back. A week before Passover, Egypt is in the center.
Yeah, I feel like it's like the perfect timing and when those experiences when like the parsha lines up exactly with your life. Like here's the podcast lining up with Pesach, so it's the perfect topic. So okay,
Everyone's
this
doing
is
their
our part
cleaning.
two of Egypt. So we're going to basically, I think, jump in first, as you said, with a chronology, just a quick chronology to get us up to speed. And then we're going to deal with some more sort of mid history and modern history to understand, because there's a couple things that we need to understand. First of all, as you've mentioned, Jews in Egypt and our history in that country. And presently, to understand what's happening in Gaza, we also need to understand Egypt. So, okay, where do we begin in terms of chronology? How do we go?
So last time we spoke, Ellie, we talked about ancient Egypt going back that 4,500 years, and the pyramids, and obviously the Exodus narrative, which is about 3,300 years ago. I think this Passover is 3,339 years, maybe
38th.
3,300.
It's the 38th. I just
38?
taught it. Yeah, it's our
Okay, 38.
3,338th Seder this year.
Yeah, but the interesting, I mean, we'll get to later that the Jewish connection to Egypt goes on for thousands of years after. But that's the
Mm.
event that we all think of. But before we go into the Jewish connection, we should talk about, Egypt, which is, like we mentioned last time, was conquered a few times. The Hyksos, the Assyrians, the Persian Empire. But the end of Egypt, really, as an independent state, is Alexander the Great, who around 331 BCE, he sidetracks through what is today Lebanon down through Israel. That's the interaction of Alexander the Great meeting Shimon HaTzadik, the high priest, and he keeps going down to Egypt, and he conquers Egypt. And then he dies in 323 BCE after having campaigned for 10 years, and his empire splits up into big parts. One is basically where Greece is, but another part is going to be in what is based in what is Mesopotamia, we talked about before, which is the area of Iraq, Syria, which is called the Seleucid. These are all named after his generals, the Seleucid Greek Empire. And then in Egypt, there's going to be a separate Greek empire that's given over to his general Ptolemy, with the P being silent. So there's a Ptolemy, and these are rival empires. So you have big chunks of Greek empire in the Eastern Mediterranean that will exist until they're overrun by the Romans. But initially, and just to fast forward through that and then come back to the Jewish connection, those will exist by the year 30 before the Common Era. In the year 30, that is when Mark Antony, I mean, we mentioned before that the Ptolemies and the Cleopatras, the kings and queens of Egypt, therefore will be Greeks. So there'll be a Greek political ruling for 300 years over what was ancient Egypt. And again, a mixing of the cultures, of the culture that Greece brings into the Middle East with the Egyptian culture. So those people like Cleopatra the Seventh, whose boyfriend was Mark Antony, this is a Roman hanging out with a Greek in Egypt. But in all of the infighting and tumult in the Roman Empire that we're not going to go into because it's just too much information, when Rome is basically transitioning out of being a republic into an empire, first you have Julius Caesar, and he's killed, and then you're going to have the final showdown in the Roman Empire is going to be between Mark Antony, whose girlfriend is Cleopatra, and Octavian. And at the Battle of Actium, which is a sea battle that takes place off the coast of Egypt, Mark Antony and Cleopatra lose, and they both commit suicide. And Octavian, who becomes Augustus, takes over. And it's in about the year 30 before the Common Era. Now, Egypt, which was ruled for like 300 years by the Greeks, by the Ptolemaic Greek Empire, is now becomes part of the Roman Empire. And that Roman control will continue for many, many, many centuries. We know that,
Did
yeah,
Egypt retain its name under Roman control? Meaning, often Rome changes the names of places in order to assert its dominance. Did they change any of the names in Egypt?
No, it's known. It's Egypt. It's Egypt. I don't know the Latin if they pronounce it the same way. My Latin isn't very good. But again, Egypt was vital to the Roman Empire because we talked about the flooding of the Nile, the seasonal flooding of the Nile, and the wheat of Egypt was really the major food supply for the Roman Empire. So that was very, very important, exporting it across the Mediterranean to Italy. Um, but we know that Rome, which is the pagan Roman Empire, which will control the entire Mediterranean during Pax Romana in the beginning of the Common Era for several hundred years, it's all a Roman. The Mediterranean is a Roman lake. But we know that, the Roman Empire splits into an Eastern Empire, a Western Empire. Constantine, we're talking about in the fourth century. And basically, from the fourth century of the Common Era through more or less the mid seventh century, when the Muslims show up, what is Egypt, which was formerly a separate country, then Greek, then pagan Roman, now becomes part of the Eastern Greek speaking Byzantine Empire, which is based in Constantinople. That's what Constantine did. He splits the empire, the Eastern Greek speaking side, and what is today Istanbul, Constantinople, and then Rome. And the Western Roman Empire, by the way, will fall to the barbarian German hordes in 475 of the Common Era, while the Eastern Roman Empire will cease to exist in 1453, finally conquered. But it will, what we know is the Levant and North Africa there will fall to the Muslims. It's a period of like 2 years of conquest, but in around the year 640 of the Common Era, I mean, Islam is only founded in 622 and rapidly expands out of the Arabian Peninsula to the Middle East, and then eventually gets out to the Far East and all the way to America today. But in around the year 640, the Common Era, the early caliphs, the Rashidim, the early caliphates, that the successors to Muhammad will conquer Egypt, and it will be basically all the way through until the early 20th century, part of the Ottoman Turkish Empire. So it's going to go different Islamic empires will rule over the Middle East. Way too complicated to go into who rules out of where. But what's also interesting is during the Fatimid, which is a Shiite Islamic empire that will rule Egypt from about the 10th to the 12th centuries. They will be based in Cairo. So you actually will have one of these Islamic dynasties, which will, some of them will rule out of the Hijaz, out of Saudi Arabia, but out of Cairo, Istanbul, Damascus, Baghdad. They rule out of different places in the Levant or the northern North Africa. But that would be the one Islamic dynasty until the 12th century that will actually rule out of Cairo. And then the Mamelukes will come along. Again, this is very complicated. The Mamelukes are actually slave warriors that the Fatimids, they kidnap children from the Caucasus and convert them to Islam and raise them, like the Janissary were in Turkey, or they were slave warriors who will take over Egypt, um, and they will. This is the Mamelukes will rule Egypt and follow, and much of the Middle East, and then finally the Ottomans will come in the 16th century. It will become part of the Ottoman Empire, which will be in the 17th, late 16th, early 17th century. The Ottoman Empire will be the largest, probably the largest, one of the largest empires in the world. It will control part of North Africa, the Middle East, going up through Turkey, all the way into the Balkans, into Greece, into all these different places. So we've gone from Islamic control, and the last Muslims to control for basically 400 years are going to be the Ottoman Turks. And with the collapse, by the way, it's interesting, in the beginning of the 19th century, there's going to be a guy by the name of Muhammad Ali, not to be confused with a boxer, who's like an Albanian who's appointed by the Turks to rule Egypt, and he will like break away and become independent. It's interesting. There's all kinds of interesting stories about him.
Wild.
But basically, by the time you get to the beginning of the 20th century in World War One, from 1914 to 1918, during that period, in the middle of World War One, the British will basically take over. By 1915, it will become a British protectorate. So it's part of that the British Empire, which in the beginning of the 20th century will be the largest physical empire in the world.
So I didn't
And
realize that Egypt at some point was under British rule. So that's fascinating also. It also speaks to this misconception that we have in the West, which is that Egypt has always been this monolithic um, nation or country that has always been Arabic, always been Muslim. You know, the pyramids were built by ancient Muslim Arab peoples. Like there's just a certain look and a narrative that goes along with it. But from what you're saying, and this is often the misconception from the North American mind, these places have been around for thousands of years and multiple rulers and multiple peoples, and not all of them have been Arabic and Muslim. So it's a fascinating thing to sort of break it down. So once Egypt ends up under British rule, what does that look like?
well, it's a British protectorate through World War One. You know, we've talked a number of times about the creation of the modern Middle East, and between the end of World War One and World War Two, all of these different countries are going to be created. You know, Lebanon, Syria, Transjordan, which becomes Jordan at different periods of time, over a period of about 20 or so years, from the early to the mid 20th century, these different countries will be born. And in 1922, this is right around the time when the British are getting the mandate to rule Palestine. And in 1922, Egypt will gain its independence, basically. But you also have to appreciate that independence is an interesting because in 1869, the Suez Canal is built by the French, by the way. But the French and the British are basically running the Suez Canal. That's their major source of trade route running through there. So that's very important to them. And so they will maintain, even though independence is not 100% independence. They still have a lot of sort of quasi-colonial control over Egypt. But there'll be a king whose name is King Farouk, who's going to rule Egypt from 1936 until I believe it is 1952. There's a revolution in Egypt. So we'll have an independent country, sort of, with a lot of influence from the British over it. Modern Cairo is basically built by the British and the French, which isn't so modern anymore. At the beginning of the 20th, if you go and visit, you see a lot of the buildings that were built during the time of the colonial occupation of Egypt in that period of time. But basically, the history of modern Egypt is a separate state, Arab Islamic state, which is a Sunni state, which, by the way, is the largest uh, Arab state population wise. I'm forgetting what's the population of Egypt of today. 80 million. I don't remember what it is. I don't remember what it is, but it's very large. Um, that is a 20th century phenomenon. As you said correctly, we see a process of different people settling, Greeks and Romans and Byzantines, and then a large Arab population floods in. So, like we said in part one, there's definitely DNA in North African, the Islamic population of North Africa is genetically very different from the Islamic population. They're all kind of called Arabs today. And they're all part of the Arab League. The 22 states of the Arab League is all of North Africa and running all the way through to, what is Iraq. Uh, but the genetic makeup of these peoples varies depending upon the mix of what other ancient peoples were fed into the eastern side of that world versus the western side of that world, which is North Africa versus Mesopotamia, Iraq, and Syria. So you can find genetically this core of ancient Egypt in there. I'm not an expert on genetics and certainly not the genetics of ancient Egypt, but as you say correctly, the notion that somehow this is, modern Egypt is very proud of its ancient heritage, but it kind of would be like, Canadians in Canada being really into totem poles and all the indigenous culture of the people they've now subsumed, but it's not really them anymore. It's the same kind of thing. So, right, people don't have
Right.
the vision to look back far enough to see how much Egypt has changed. And it's really very much more of a heterogeneous population than it was a long time ago,
And when you
certainly.
say Egypt, now, I believe you said the king Farouk was Sunni. Can you just remind all of us which team is that? Is that team Iran or team Saudi Arabia? Which one is
In
Sunni
Saudi
and which
Arabia.
one is Shia?
Well, like the large, I mean, not the largest. I mean, remember, there's like 56 countries that are Muslim, and there's 22 states of the Arab League. So the largest Sunni Arab state is Indonesia. So these are not Arabs, but of Arab states, Egypt is the largest. It's also got a very significant military, which is largely equipped by the United States. They even make Abrams tanks there and have, American F-16 fighter planes there. So it's very much as a byproduct of weaning them off of the Soviet Union's influence, American back. So it's quite a powerful country militarily. But the Sunni members, Sunni population, the center of the Shiite Islamic power in the Middle East, or it's not really is Iran. And there's large Shiite populations in places like Iraq and stuff like that. But it's Team Saudi Arabia, but they're rivals.
Got it,
Very
of
different.
course.
Saudi Arabia is a huge piece of real estate with not a lot of
Okay.
people in it, but one heck of a lot of money due to oil. Egypt was not blessed with the oil, so it's a massive population that is greatly. It's a very poor country.
Mm.
Very poor country, always on the brink of revolution and political instability because of the poverty, and has never really developed. It's really a very third world place. But
Wow.
if you just to continue the chronology of Egypt, we go up to who deposes King Farouk. They put his son in power, but it's Gamal Abdel Nasser, who's an Egyptian nationalist leader, very charismatic political leader of Egypt, who, by the way, when he takes over Egypt from 1958 to 1961, Egypt and Syria will merge into a country called the United Arab Republic for just 2 years. They'll try, even though they have no common border. It's an interesting thing they try and do. It does not
Yeah,
last.
I remember
But
hearing
but
about that.
But Nasser is kind of he's not an Islamist leader. This is like he's a pan-Arab nationalist guy. Again, very charismatic. He's the one who's really whipping up. Remember, in 1948, when Egypt is already an independent state, that's when Israel declares independence, and Egypt is one of the 6 countries that sends military forces to attack it. It comes up from the south. The Egyptian Air Force bombs Tel Aviv. So, as a byproduct of the end in 1949, when the War of Independence ends, Israel does not have a peace treaty with Egypt. There's an armistice agreement signed that is based on the Sinai, which is the modern border that Israel has today, is basically the armistice line. But we have to throw in, during modern history, in 1956, when Nasser, the nationalist leader of Egypt, who's very anti-colonialist, they basically nationalized the Suez Canal, like throw the British out. And that's when we have the Suez campaign, when basically France, England, and with supporting an Israeli invasion of the Sinai Peninsula, they take the Suez Canal to get it back from, to show Nasser who's boss. That's when Eisenhower moves in and makes Israel pull out. So we think of Israel getting the Sinai in the 67 war, but Israel actually got to the Suez Canal in 1956 and then had to pull back again. So, but still, there's no peace treaty. But when after Nasser dies, um, we have who takes over, in Egypt is you have Anwar Sadat, who is who's the leader of Egypt, and it's Sadat who, we have. Well, remember, Nasser goes past the Suez affair. He's the one who's involved in the 67 Six-Day War, and he dies after
Right.
that. And
Hmm.
Sadat takes over, and it's Sadat who will rule from 1971 to 1981, and it's
Hmm.
he who will remember. Israel until this time has been in a state of like peace treaty with. We're getting ahead of ourselves. I wanted to go back. I see I'm already getting out of my sequence of what I wanted to do, but it's he who will basically open the door to relations with Israel, because in 1977, it's he who will visit Israel, the first Arab
Mm.
leader to visit Israel, when Menachem Begin is prime minister. And in 1979, we have the signing of the first peace treaty that Israel has with an Arab state, and a major Arab state, like a really powerful country.
So let's go
So,
back then, because I know this was something we wanted to get into, which is before we hit that point where Israel and Egypt signed a peace treaty. Tell us a little bit about the history of Jews in Egypt, because I think it's so important and relevant to what's happening today. Um, First of all, look, we're reading the Passover story, which is all about the Jews leaving Egypt for good. How do we end up back there?
Right. So that, yes, that's what I wanted to talk about before we got into modern history. Thank you for reminding me of that. But right, we live Egypt about 3,300 years ago, and there's actually a commandment not to go back to Egypt. And we've wandered in the desert for 40 years, and we entered the land of Israel. We have a period of time of the judges, almost 4 centuries of that, and then we have King David conquering Jerusalem, and we have the United Monarchy, which is Saul, then David, then Solomon, and the country splits into two kingdoms, but we're going to have all the Jews basically living in what is today the land of Israel, with Jerusalem as the capital, the spiritual and political capital of of the land of Israel. But we know that the northern kingdom of the 10 tribes, which splits away from the southern kingdom of Judah after the death of King Solomon, both the northern and southern kingdoms will become vassal states of the Assyrian and later the Babylonian Empire. And it's during the period of time, about going back 2,700 years ago, when the Assyrian Empire is basically slowly whittling away at the northern kingdom, that refugees from that northern kingdom of Israel will flee south, not only to Judah, but also it seems they seem to flee further south and leave Israel. It's like we're not just in America, we're going to Mexico, and they head down to Egypt. Why do we know that? Because in a place called Elephantine in the Upper Nile, which is an island fortress in the Nile, going all the way back to the 7th century BCE, there's a Jewish military garrison position there for several hundred years. There's all kinds of interesting papyrus, the papyrus writing documents and boule seals that have been found there. Some of them are from the Jewish community. They're written in Aramaic, which is the lingua franca, the international language of the Levant, of the Middle East. So we have there's a lot of debate about this. We can try and piece together based on the documents when exactly they got there, but it seems that they go all the way back to Jewish refugees from the destruction of the Northern Kingdom, who seem to be hired as mercenaries by the Egyptians to guard this very important island garrison position on the Nile, which of course is a big trade route, people traveling back and forth on the Nile River. They also set up a temple site there. Interesting. There's an idea that once the temple in Jerusalem is built, we're
Wow.
not supposed to have other temple sites, but there's going to be more than one temple site built in Egypt. So it's a very people can Google Elephantine to find out about it. It's one of the earlier diaspora communities, which means think about it. That's like maybe like 600-700 years after we leave Egypt.
Wow.
That
It's
there's
also
Jews
like
back in
such a
Egypt.
Jewish thing to do, right? Like, okay, let's just build another. It's like a breakaway minion. Like, we
Yeah,
just build another
exactly.
shul. It's just such a crazy thing that we do.
So you have that community, which is very, very interesting. And then if we fast forward, that goes back to pre even destruction of the first temple, which is more or less 2,500 years ago. We know when the first temple is destroyed. Remember, it's like more than 100 years before the destruction of the first temple. The Northern Kingdom has already been destroyed, like 130 years earlier. But when the first temple is destroyed by the Babylonians, and the vast majority of Jews are carried away into captivity to Babylon for 70 years, the Babylonians leave some Jews in Judah, and they're led by a guy by the name of Gedaliah ben Achikam. He's appointed by the Babylonians to be kind of their representative of the few Jews that are remaining there. Jeremiah the prophet is there also. He's the prophet who's forecasting the destruction of Jerusalem, and he's not listened to by the later kings. But this guy Gedaliah is murdered by this Jew named Ishmael. Interesting enough, he's killed and against Jeremiah's wishes and prophecies, the Jews flee basically to Egypt. They're afraid of retribution at the hands of the Babylonians because the guy they left in power is killed. So they go down there. So there are Jews living, and they probably augment the Elephantine community. So Jews are reestablishing themselves, 2,500 years ago in Egypt, and that's a presence that's going to exist. So we basically have Jews living in Egypt for 2,700 years ago until today. Very few left today, but there's a Jewish community there. So that's the Babylonian exile. But if we fast forward 70 years later, when the Persians take over the Babylonian Empire, and Jews are allowed to return, and the Second Commonwealth, which is also known as the Second Temple period, is reestablished. And as just like in modern history, once Israel is reestablished as a state, a lot more Jews pour in. The Jewish community of Israel will once again be reborn and grow significantly. And this is where we have an interesting intersection between what we talked about before with the Greeks, because when Alexander dies, what is Judea becomes basically under the control of the Ptolemaic Egyptian Greek Empire. So they're the vassal. We become a vassal state of that Greek kingdom that rules out of Egypt. And then in the year 198, before the Common Era, they fight the Battle of Panias with the Seleucids about 2,200 years ago. These two rival Greek kingdoms, one in Mesopotamia and Syria and one in Egypt, fight a battle. And the Ptolemies lose to the Seleucids, and what Judea becomes part of the Seleucid Greek Empire. But if we just rewind, by the way, just an interesting story, it's during the reign of King Ptolemy II, going back to the third century, when they're ruling over Judah. That's the famous story of the creation of the Septuagint, the translation, the Targum Shivim, when he takes 70 rabbis and puts them in 70 rooms, and he tells them, please translate the Torah of your master Moses into Greek. This is the first translation of the Bible into another language. So that's an interesting little story that takes place there. So that's the first time that Gentiles get their hand on our book. And since
Wow.
then they've had of it and mistranslating it, not paying us any royalties for it. And we can make a lot of money on that. Sue them for copyright infringement going back, 2,300 years. But once we get to the story of Seleucid control of Judea, that is the background to the story of the Maccabees.
Mm.
And it's during that period of time, this is related to Egypt, even though the Egyptian Greeks no longer control Judea. This is an interesting story because we know that the Seleucids start interfering in the communal and religious life of the Jews of Judea.
Mm.
And this is the backstory in the second century before the Common Era to the Hanukkah narrative. One of the things that happens is the priesthood becomes corrupted by foreign influence. A lot of the priesthood become Sadducees, who are breakaway Jews from mainstream Judaism. And it's during the Maccabean revolt that we have in the second century when the priestly family, the Maccabees, is fighting the Seleucid Greek Empire in this protracted war that will schlep out for 25 years, where the Greeks control the temple and they're buying and selling the office of the high priest at this point. And the priests, who are often very corrupted themselves, are paying large bribes for it. You can read this in Josephus. He has all the backstory to this. Well, that's too complicated. We're already too much information. But there is a priest by the name of Onias the Third, and he has sons, and one is named Jay. Anyway, this very corrupt priest named Jason takes over, and his brother, who's also known as Onias the Fourth, he gets really upset that he's not chosen as the high priest, and he flees to Egypt. And in a place called Heliopolis in the Upper Nile, near Alexandria, he sets up an alternative temple site. So here you have a real with Kohanim serving in this temple site in the Nile, like much further north than Heliopolis,
So
that
wild.
community, which is much older. So now you have this alternative temple site, which is totally prohibited in Judaism, but nonetheless, there are priests serving there. And that will serve as a temple site all the way up through the year about 73, 74 of the Common Era, which is after the Great Revolt against the Romans, when the Romans will destroy that site, fearing it'll be a source. The Jews will have a temple in there and they'll rebel, whatever. So look at that. So you have this Jewish community you have significant Jewish presence and alternative cultic sites in Egypt and Jews living there all the way through the early beginnings of the Common Era. And then when we get to the Islamic period, we see that there's very significant Jewish communities living all throughout all North Africa. As the Byzantine Empire, which was not nice to the Jews, is pushed out by the Muslims, and as the early Islamic dynasties were actually quite open to Jews comparative to the Byzantines, you have Jews settling in North Africa and settling in Egypt. And then we talked about in 711 how the Muslims cross the Straits of Gibraltar and conquer Spain. But when 1492, when Spain is reconquered by Ferdinand and Isabella, the Reconquista, and we have the expulsion of the Jews on July 31st of 1492, huge Jewish community, a huge chunk of that Jewish community of Spain will then either resettle back in North Africa or go to the Eastern Levant and settle in what is the Ottoman Turkish Empire over there. So that is when people like Maimonides, who was born in 1135 and died in 1204, Maimonides' family will flee Spain. And they will, this is early in the expulsion, way before the expulsion. This is in the 12th century. This is during Islamic persecution in Spain. There was some of that going on. But you see, going back 1,000 years ago, Maimonides will settle in Fustat in Cairo, and he will be the physician to the Islamic ruler who is Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi. So there'll be another Ayyubid dynasty will also rule out of Cairo. So so you have a very significant community in Cairo, and a very significant community of Karaites in Cairo who are a breakaway. The origins of the Karaite movement is a bit of a mystery, but some people think it goes back to, it's basically dated to about the ninth, 8th centuries in Baghdad, in the Levant, when a apostate Jew basically goes off and creates an offshoot of mainstream Judaism, denying the oral Torah. And that will become a very powerful movement in the entire Near East. A lot of Jews will become Karaite Jews. And the Rambam, Maimonides, is leading the spiritual, one of the people who leads the spiritual counteroffensive to Karaism, taking over mainstream Judaism in North Africa. So there's the history goes back a very long time. There's the very famous Cairo Geniza, which was found, by Oxford University, Solomon Schechter, Cambridge University, in the 19th century, which was all these documents shoved for 1,000 years into this shaft that had God's name on it, which is an invaluable source of information about Jewish life in Egypt, including finding letters signed by Maimonides, who was based there. So it's like the history goes on and on and on, but the Jewish community of Egypt basically goes back 2,700 years and has been there throughout the Islamic period and up until modern times. There was, if you fast forward through Egypt becoming an independent country in 1947, there was between 65,000 and 85,000 Jews living in Egypt.
So what happens to those Jews when the state of Israel is formed? How does that then go down?
Yeah, so Jews play as always, we play the great middleman role in a lot of things in commerce and trade, and Jews are always, the intelligentsia, valued by the local authorities for their literacy and their connections. By the way, with the establishment of the Suez Canal, you see the same thing with the Panama Canal today, that I know a lot of Syrian Jews moved in there to do business. Canals are a great source of business. So you have a lot of Jews will move into Egypt to be involved in the business of the Suez Canal, which is a great transit point for commerce. So the community will actually grow because there's economic opportunities there. That's how we Jews migrate. We go with who are welcomed in and with economic opportunities. So once we get to 1947, 1948, pretty much with the UN partition vote in November 29th, 1947, the violence, there'll be a huge upsurge in anti-Jewish violence throughout the Middle East. I'm not talking about directed at Israel, we're talking about directed at the local Jewish communities that are living there. And Nasser, who was running Egypt at the time, who is a nationalist, this stuff is never good. And he was very hardcore anti-Israel, and he's rallying the troops to destroy the Jewish state. So from 1947, with the War of Independence, the persecution of Jews will increase tremendously, and Jews will start to leave the country. And by 1967, what was between 65,000 and 85,000 Jews will shrink to like 12,000 Jews. Remember, Israel is actively involved in trying to smuggle those Jews, as the entire Arab Middle East is being ethnically cleansed of its Jewish population of about 850,000 people in total, who had been there for a very long time. Like you see, the Jews are living in a place like Elephantine and Heliopolis way before Islam, way before Islam. Um, so we're subsumed by the expanding Islamic dynasties. But during this period of time, basically from 1947 through 1967, the entire Middle East is basically ethnically cleansed of its Jewish population. And that's the story of what happens to Jews in Egypt. So by the time you get to, if we fast forward until today, we see that there is less than 20 Jews left in Egypt. Kind of tragic. When I went
Wow.
to Egypt in the early 1980s, there was a synagogue with police guarding it, and there was still a few Jews there. And
Surprised there's
we had a
any
min
left there, like just with the, you know, the veracity of the anti-Semitism on the streets in many of those Arab countries. I'm surprised there's any Jews left there at all. It's fascinating.
There's just a few old Jews left who don't want to leave, but that's basically the situation. But think about that.
Right.
If we go back in time, that means like up until a few decades ago, for 2,700 years, there was a Jewish community living in Egypt. Interesting, by the way, that
Right.
one of the 613 commandments, is a negative commandment number 42, is like don't go back to Egypt.
Mm, right.
Maimonides himself is back in Egypt, not only being a great rabbi, but being a physician to the family of Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi. There's a story about how he would sign all of his letters, and he was really one of the great Jewish minds of all time. Rabbi Moses ben Maimon, who daily violates the commandment of living in Egypt. There's a lot of discussion about how accurate that one is.
Wow.
But then there's also a discussion about how could rabbis live, how could you live in Egypt? So as with everything, without going into a whole halachic discussion, like if you're already born in Egypt, you can stay in Egypt. It only holds true when the majority of Jews are living in the land of Israel. There's situations
Right.
in which it's like everything in halacha, it's always nuanced. But clearly, even though Jeremiah told the Jews not to go back and it wouldn't end well for them, Jews
Mm,
went back and have been back for a very, very long time. And now they're finally back. The vast majority of, by the way, those Egyptian Jews will end up coming to Israel. Like I think it's like 58,000 of the 65 to 85,000 Jews are Egyptian Jews living in Israel today. So that's kind of the end of the story where, like many places, like Poland, you now have empty Jewish buildings that tourists visit, but no more Jews living in what were major Jewish centers. Cairo was a huge center of Jewish life going back 1,000 years, and today is no more.
right.
So that's kind of the history of Jews, the Jews there.
So now we move towards the connection with Gaza because if people have looked at a map, Gaza is actually bordering Egypt, has quite a large border with Egypt. And at some point, if I understand, is actually part of Egypt or it's under Egyptian control. So now, if we move to modern times, what is the relationship between Gaza and Egypt and Israel? How does this whole thing work out? And why do we end up with like a 7 layer sealed border between Egypt and Gaza in modern day Egypt?
Right. So if we go up to, remember, 1967, Gamal Abdel Nasser is the president of Egypt, seizes power. He's the guy running the country. He's one of the major, you talk about 67 war was basically Egypt, Jordan, and Syria were the three countries that are attacking Israel. As but actually we have to actually back up. Excuse me, I'm getting ahead of myself. We go to 1948 in the War of Independence. Um, when six Arab armies declare war and invade, Egypt will be stopped. Israel manages to take Eilat. The last thing Israel takes in the War of Independence is Eilat. The southernmost part of Israel is down there. But Egypt will get the Gaza Strip, which was not part of Egyptian territory. But they will, just as Jordan will take Judea and Samaria, which is called the West Bank, and East Jerusalem, including the Old City, Egypt will get the Gaza Strip, and it will be ruled by Egypt from 48 to 67. And this is when, and we're talking about, this is a period of time when King Farouk is president to Nasser, when Egypt changes from a monarchy to being ruled by Nasser. And by the way, during that period of time, from 48 onward, Fedayeen, these guerrillas will launch attacks into Israel from Jordanian occupied West Bank territory and also from the Gaza Strip. Everyone's welcome to check out Operation Black Arrow, when Israel goes into Gaza City to try and clean out the terrorists. This is going back a long time ago, but it's interesting. One of those counterterrorism maneuvers that Israel's trying to do because those Gaza communities that were attacked on October 7th are also being attacked by then. This is not something new. As soon as Israel's born and the ceasefire is signed, there's terrorist attacks and infiltrations that are taking place all on the borders with Israel. It was a very difficult situation. If we fast forward to 1967, when this time only three Arab countries, Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, try and destroy Israel, they lose big in 6 days, a tremendous military victory. And Egypt not only loses Gaza, but Israel takes the entire Sinai Peninsula to the eastern bank of the Suez Canal. So Israel actually controls this huge piece of land, which is bigger than the state of Israel. And Israel will hold on to that all the way until the peace treaty. Israel also at the same time in the north, of course, the Jordanian army will flee from its occupied territory that it held for 19 years in Judea and Samaria and Jerusalem and flee back to its internationally recognized border. Israel does not control territory within Jordan. And again, and in the north, in the Golan Heights, Israel will seize the Golan Heights, which was used as a launching point for artillery attacks and sniping and terrorism from up there, and hold on to that until today, by the way. Um, so that's 1967. 1973, when Sadat is now taken over from Nasser and is ruling Egypt, Israel, which was very cocky and thinking the Arabs will never attack us because we beat them so badly in 67. This time we're down to two Arab countries. We go from 6 countries to 3 countries to 2 countries. In 1973 Yom Kippur War, the Arabs who will learn their lessons and be heavily restocked by the Soviet Union with anti-aircraft, anti-tank missiles will, this is not a war to destroy Israel, by the way. This was let's grab some territory back so we're in a better position to negotiate from a position of strength. But they will be remarkably successful initially in overrunning Israeli positions in the Golan Heights. Jordan is not involved, and overrunning the Bar Lev line, which is a defensive line that Israel built in the Sinai with these big sand embankments. They just breach them and get inside. And Israel suffers tremendous initial losses, and it's a very difficult war. But in the end, Israel ends up pushing the Egyptians back across the Suez Canal, crossing the Suez itself, and going on the way to Cairo. Israel could have taken Cairo. The Soviet Union threatened to nuke Israel because they were freaking out. And Israel not only pushes the Syrians off the Golan Heights, but is on the way to Damascus. And then we return kind of like to the same ceasefire lines we have with Israel controlling the Suez Canal and Israel controlling the Golan Heights. But now that Egypt felt, even though they ended up losing big in the end of that war, because they initially were successful, this is a very big thing in the Arab Islamic mentality. Now that we have managed to, we won. Egypt till today has a victory parade to celebrate their victory in the 73 war, Yom Kippur War. But now, because they got their honor back and were initially successful, this will lead Sadat to make overtures to Israel. And again, this is when Jimmy Carter's president, and this is 1977, when Menachem Begin is prime minister. This is the first right-wing government in Israel. He's the first, he gets into power in 77. He will visit Israel. And in 1979, Israel will sign its first peace treaty with an Arab state, contingent on removing itself from the Sinai Peninsula with this massive peace, which is done in stages, by the way. All after 1982, Israel had built communities, Yamit in the Sinai, which had to be evacuated forcibly by the army because the people who settled there did not want to leave there. You can go look at Yamit. But that led to a return to a internationally recognized border with a country we have a peace treaty with, which is Egypt. But, Egypt lost the Gaza Strip in 1967, and Israel got control of it. And now, just as in Judea and Samaria, Israel is ruling over an Arab population, which was not under its control previously. Israel now had control of the Gaza Strip. And by the way, offered in 67, Israel immediately offered Egypt, as it offered Jordan, we'll pull out of all the territory, even though it leaves us only 9 miles wide. Just make peace with us. And the Arab League got together a few months later in August of 1967 and basically said no peace with Israel, no recognition, no negotiation. So Israel
Right.
would have been happy, by the way. Whereas Israel would not give back Judea and Samaria to Jordan, Israel would have been very happy to pull out of the Gaza Strip and let Egypt have it again as part of the peace deal in
Right.
the 19th. But Egypt doesn't want it. Egypt doesn't want it at all. So Israel's been stuck. But in the meantime, we know what happened since the 67 Six-Day War. Israel started to build dozens of communities in Gaza. We talked about Gaza already, that were all, again, in going back to 2005, eventually is just like with Yamid, the Israeli army went in and removed the Jewish settlement from there. Israel is the only
Right.
country that does this, removes its own population and gives it to other people. But that's this that but what happened what's happened is with the peace treaty of 1979, if you anyone looks at a map of Gaza, you'll see that the southern border of the Gaza Strip, which is like 25 miles long, it has a very long southern border with Egypt into the Sinai that is not controlled by Israel, which is important to keep in mind today. That's called now during the period of time from the signing of the peace treaty with Egypt until the Oslo Accords and Israel pulling out, Israel maintained a security corridor, which is called the Philadelphia Corridor, that was basically designed to keep Gaza separate from Egypt to prevent smuggling. Once Israel pulled out of there in 2005, then they dug all these tunnels underneath, and the smuggling was huge. So a lot of the
Right.
weapons that entered, because I did military service on the Egyptian border and reserve duty. The Egyptian army is very corrupt. There's a huge amount of drug smuggling into Israel. So a lot of the weapons that were smuggled in to Gaza and a lot of the equipment used to build the tunnels, including huge tunnels that you could drive cars through,
Right. I
like
remember when they
trucks.
shut all of that down, Egypt was panicking because it was such a huge black market for them that they were getting millions and millions of dollars of Qatari money paying them for being able to smuggle arms into Gaza.
Exactly. But what happened, and this is all connected to Egypt. So we have that border, and technically Egypt, there is a crossing there that Egypt rarely opened. But what happened in 1987 during the first Intifada, the first uprising, uh, you had the birth of Hamas, and Hamas is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood was founded in 1928 by Hassan al-Banna in Egypt, and he was persona non grata in Egypt. But the Muslim Brotherhood was a radical Islamic institution, which was really into like Islamic fundamentalism and social work, but it's become, even though they got involved in a lot of social work with the poor Arabs of Egypt, a lot of it was about spreading Islamist ideology, and Hamas is really an offshoot of that. So it was founded in 1987. So this is the really Islamatization of the population of Gaza. And once 2005 hits and Israel leaves, remember they have elections in Gaza. Hamas wins. They beat Fatah, the Palestinian Authority, out in the election, and then they basically cleanse of Gaza of the Palestinian Authority by killing them or expelling them. And what does Egypt do? Egypt doesn't want this Islamic stuff pouring into Egypt itself. So they basically seal off the border in 2005. So there's like so they don't because this is trouble for them too. The Islamists have been trouble for Egypt for a century already now. So because what people don't realize is even when Israel pulled out and even when Israel decided because it became a little mini Islamic terror state ruled by Hamas and as from 2007 onward, Egypt could have built an airport and a port in the Sinai Peninsula and allowed Hamas free access that Israel could do nothing about because Israel has a peace treaty with Egypt. There was an airport that was built in Gaza as part of the peace accords, and then when they went radical, Israel just blew it up, and Israel maintains a naval blockade a number of miles off the coast to prevent smuggling. But everyone seems to forget that they talk about Gaza as a large outdoor prison.
Open air prison, right?
Yeah, that Israel can, Israel because of the terrorist infiltrations is not allowed to enter Israel. But until that time, there was thousands of Gazan workers used to cross freely into Israel, and
And even up until now, there were still Gazan workers crossing into Israel. They just had to go through a border, which is
yeah,
kind
much
of
much less.
normal if it's not part of Israel. You have to cross the border to go from Canada to the US also, especially if you're working, which most people can't do here. Can't cross into the US and work and then, like there's just a lot of normalcy about them having to cross the border. But I think what's interesting also, and it seems to me that Israel actually had a much more porous border with Gaza than Egypt does, right? Are there Gazans crossing over on a regular basis into Egypt?
Well, it's Egypt built a very significant wall.
Right.
And they have no problem shooting people because they know that the, International Criminal Court will not condemn them doing it. Yeah, they're pretty brutal in shooting like Somali refugees trying to cross into Israel. My own kids, my own daughter who served in Caracal on the border there, she told me some pretty horrific stories about interacting with refugees trying to cross into Israel and being prevented to doing so and what the Egyptians did to them. But when, this is the story of the Middle East, when Arabs do things to other Arabs or third worlders do it to each other, the world doesn't get anywhere near as upset as Israel. But you have this situation now where you have this little mini Islamicized state, which is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood founded in 1987. You have to appreciate what happened in Egypt at the end of this story is that in 2012, Mohammed Morsi took over Egypt till 2000 for like a year, like that. And he was an Islamist, which is really bad news for Israel because all you need is like a super anti-Islamist regime. I mean, after Sadat, you had Hosni Mubarak rules from 1981 through 2011. Sadat was murdered, by the way, in 1979 for signing no 1981, excuse me, for signing the peace treaty with Israel. Islamists in Egypt murdered him at a military parade. I remember this. They're just marching the parade, and then they turn their guns on him and they kill him in the bleachers. And then who takes over is Hosni Mubarak, who rules for a really long time, from 1981 until 2011. He's like an unelected successor. That's a really long time to rule, 81, 2011. And then Morsi takes over in 2012. There's an election. He's the only actual elected person in Egypt. And he's deposed like a year later by a former Israeli general whose name is Fatal al-Sisi, who today is ruling Egypt until today. So for about 1 year, you have a kind of a Muslim Brotherhood based regime that was elected in Egypt, which was very bad for Israel because imagine them opening up the border with Gaza and allowing the free flow of weapons in and not impeding it. As bad as it was under the control since 2013 of the non-Islamic regime that rules Egypt, it would have been 1,000 times worse. But this is the mess we're sitting in today. So now we are stuck dealing with Gaza. We would love to give it back to Egypt today, but Egypt doesn't. Egypt is fighting an Islamist Bedouin insurgency in the Sinai Peninsula for decades
Well,
now.
it's interesting
And
because it kind of secretly trades with Gaza. So technically it actually has commerce with Gaza. They just don't want to overtly be responsible for it. They want to be able to get all the money that they get from selling them arms, but they don't want to be responsible for the people in providing them governmental services and electricity and water and food and all of those things. So it's a really parasitic, unhealthy relationship. Well, Israel has to provide them with food, electricity, and all that stuff, but Egypt will take the money when they need to buy arms. And that's just, untenable and crazy.
But the last little tweaking of all of this is as part of the peace agreement, Egypt was not allowed to. There's been a international peacekeeping force monitoring the peacekeeping agreement that Egypt is not allowed to, like the Sinai is huge. And within a huge chunk of the Sinai to the east up to the Israeli border, Egypt has not been allowed to um, bring in heavy military equipment, like tanks and things. They have to have a kind of it's low level stuff. As a way of fighting the insurgency, Israel allowed Egypt to bring more stuff in. The problem is you open that crack up and a lot more pours in. And there's a lot of tension between Israel and Egypt now going on. They violated that agreement, and there's a lot of Egyptian armaments that should not be in the eastern Sinai in the Sinai again. And Israel does not want them massing all this equipment on the border with Israel, because in theory, in a war, the Egyptian army of today is very well equipped with the most modern American military equipment, and that could not only is a violation of the peace treaty, but could pose a strategic threat to Israel. Having Egypt
How does
neutral.
Egypt have that equipment if it's a very poor country? Like who's paying for that?
Because America gives a lot of foreign aid to Israel as military aid, and the second biggest recipient is Egypt. Trump has been using, as a byproduct of what happened to Gaza, Trump was putting pressure on Egypt to take in, because Gaza is unlivable and it's getting more unlivable even now. So Trump was putting pressure on Egypt. In theory, they could build like a giant enclosure, you know, like like right next to the fence with Gaza in the South Philadelphia corridor, open it up and pour everyone in there, build a big fence around it, set up tents and hospitals and food and everything. Let's clean Gaza out. You guys stay here temporarily, like real temporary refugees in Egypt. And then we'll rebuild, get rid of Hamas, clean it out, and bulldoze all the rubble out and rebuild it. And Trump was using a lot of leverage against Egypt. A lot of it was the foreign aid leverage, I think. And if you want all those $1 billion+ from us every year that we're giving you and making Abrams tanks and all the military equipment and hardware we give you, yeah, Egypt is a very, they are a very poor country with a pretty decent sized military that has a lot of, top level, not like the
Why is
Iranian
there an
Air
Amer
Force.
But why is there an American military presence there in Egypt? Like
So
what's the strategic advantage if they have already presence in Israel?
So as opposed to 73, when the Soviet Union was the big backer, what America spent decades to do was weaning the Arab world off of Soviet equipment and becoming the big
Right,
supplier. And as part of that deal was giving financial aid and military aid, so that when you have military aid, you're supplying a country, it gives you a lot of leverage over that country's military because they need replacement
right.
parts and restocking. And it's also
Got
good
it.
for your military industrial complex. It's another country buying or using or stimulating your own military industrial complex. We give you, like Israel does, we give you billions of dollars a year, and you have to spend a huge amount of that back in our industry, subsidizing, buying tanks and equipment from us. So America has been for decades now, unlike what the Soviet Union used to be in the 60s and early 70s, America has been the supplier of so it has a lot of influence over Egypt, and it's in America's interest to maintain a big footprint in the Middle East to keep other powers out. Used to be Soviet Union, now it's of course Russia, or to keep Iran out or keep China out, whatever it is, keep them out of there. So it's a complicated, multi-layered geopolitical reality of today. But we're stuck with Egypt does not really want, nor does Jordan, to absorb all these Gazans. So we're kind of stuck in a very untenable situation, which doesn't seem to have any easy solution. Remains to see what happens. But we have been tangled up with Egypt since the
Right.
time of the Exodus, like
Yeah,
3,300
fascinating.
years of relationship. And it seems like only finally today, now we're down to a couple of Jews left finally in Egypt. Hopefully they'll come back and then we'll finally be done with them.
Right. Right. Fascinating. Such an entangled web and so interesting to kind of there's so many players on the ground. It's hard to sort of sort that out. So it's fascinating. All right. Thank you so much. Such good, meaty information before you sit down at your Passover Seder. You can go in there with a really interesting historical background on the history of Egypt and the Jewish people and Israel. Thank you so much, Rabbi Conspiro. Thank you,
Thank
everyone,
you.
for joining us. Thank you for being a part of this. Please, if you want more information or if you'd like to check out the YouTube channel that has the videos of these episodes, you can go ahead and check the liner notes or go ahead and check out Rabbi Conspiro's website at conspiro.com. You'll find all of the links to listen, to watch on there. I think that's it for today. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. Rabbi Conspiro.
Pesach Sameach.